What if the universe and your relationships are mirrors of your mind? Today we're unpacking 7 timeless principles that reveal how everything inside and out connects. Hello, I'm Simon Good, professional mediator, and welcome to the Conflict Skills Podcast. Today we're diving into what are called the 7 Hermetic principles. This is ancient wisdom rooted in the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. I'm not necessarily a history expert. The reason that I really like these 7 Hermetic principles is that they are incredibly useful analogies and lenses that we can apply to conflict and relationships, whether that is connected to workplace conflict and workplace relationships, and maybe we're dealing with some challenges there, or also in personal relationships, whether it's parenting or the relationship with our spouse, for example. These 7 principles provide really helpful lenses to understand what's happening in terms of the reciprocal pattern, what's going on between them and us, and what kind of tweaks or options we have when we would like things to be different. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful to you and interesting to you, thank you for listening. And if it's useful, I would be incredibly grateful if you would consider pressing subscribe and leaving a positive review. I saw a few positive reviews have come in this last couple of weeks, actually, and that makes a massive difference to small podcasts like this. So thank you very much in advance if that's something that you're prepared to do. So I first came across these Hermetic principles when I purchased the book called the Kybalion. To be honest, I didn't really know very much about it. I just saw it on Amazon, and I think it might have even come up under the recommended books or something like that. And on the cover of the version that I purchased, at least, there's this really cool little, it's kind of a triangle inside a circle, and then inside the triangle is a square, and then inside the square is a circle. It's this really cool little diagram of geometric shapes, and it really reminded me of J.K. Rowling's Cloak and the Wand and that kind of thing. And there's a particular diagram that she uses to represent them, which I wonder if maybe it's inspired, to say the least, from the Kybalion and these Hermetic principles. So I believe that the earliest version of the book was from back in the early 1900s, and the authors is written as the 3 initiates. At the beginning of the book, they kind of explain that the reason that they're writing this is to capture some of the wisdom of Hermes. So these 7 particular principles in the book are kind of written as a way of understanding the whole universe, you know, this new agey kind of like principles of the universe type of thing. I suppose this would have been one of the early examples of that. I mean, it's from Gnosticism, and a lot of the principles here are similar to the Gnostic branches of the different religions, Christianity, etc. So the first of the principles is mentalism, the idea that the universe is a mental creation. Now, I am very interested at the moment in different theories of the mind and theories of consciousness and philosophies of the mind. And I don't know if you've ever looked into it, but materialism would be the idea, I believe, that the only thing that exists is what we can see and touch and measure effectively. Matter and motion is sometimes the way that they put it. Dualism would be the worldview that there's 2 different bits to the universe. There's the material bit, the real atoms, etc., floating around, the forces of gravity. But there's also something else, which consciousness would be a part of. And then idealism would be that all matter somehow has consciousness built into it. Now, it's possible that I'm getting those wrong, but that's my very basic understanding of, you know, some of those concepts. And when the Kybalion refers to mentalism, it really reminds me of one of the versions, at least, of idealism. So there's different ways that you could think about that. If the whole universe is conscious, does that mean like each atom is conscious, for example? Or is there some conscious force beyond the atoms? Like there's different interpretations of that kind of thing. But regardless, this does match quite closely the first principle here. So everything begins in the mind. Reality is shaped by perception and thought. And once we start to look into the actual science, like the neurobiology of sensory perception, for example, this is literally how it works. Like our perception of the world is subjective at a very fundamental layer, and it is literally colored by and influenced by our goals, as well as what's going on for us in the current moment. And so our brain is at any one moment trying to guess what we're going to need to do next. And our perception forms a piece of putting that puzzle together. So there's no such thing in a very real way as objective reality. So this idea of mentalism really fits with, some of the science that's emerging, at least my reading of it and my interpretation from where I sit at the moment, at least. So this also would apply then to relationships. If the universe is a mental creation, then of course the relationships that you have between you and somebody else is also a mental creation. And if we pause and think about it, we, I think, realize, of course, like there's no such thing as a relationship. I can't measure it. I can't look at it and see how strong it is or see how tense things are in our relationship, this kind of thing. Our relationships are literally just a subjective perception that we've developed about how things are between us and someone else. And the interesting thing, if we pause and consider this, is that the other person that we're in a relationship with actually isn't in the same relationship with us than we are with them. Like it's all in our heads. So to me, this really presents a number of different interesting opportunities when it comes to conflict, because all of a sudden it occurs to me that I get to decide how the relationship's going to be between me and the other people around me in a very real way, starting with, affecting my literal perception, and then that would inform my thoughts and my feelings and my behavior and my body and my body's changes and all the rest of it as well. So I don't know if that resonates with you, but that first principle for me, mentalism, realizing that all relationships that we have are simply manifestations of our thoughts and feelings and goals, etc., in our head, this then gives us a higher level, I think, of control or ability to influence things in the direction that we would like it to be. What do you think? The second principle is the principle of correspondence. One way of thinking about this that's quite famous is the phrase, as above, so below, or the other side of it is, as within, so without. I find this particular phrase really resonates with me. It's been the key to unlocking a lot of the personal challenges I think that I've dealt with in terms of my own anxieties and when I've been suffering from bouts of depression and this kind of thing in the past. And I actually have this really nice little salt lamp. It's just kind of 20 centimeters high, and it sits in the corner of my office with the famous tree. You might have seen the diagram of it. The tree is kind of growing above the ground, and then there's a root structure which matches very similarly the foliage that's happening at the top of the tree underneath. And it relates to this principle, as above, so below. Patterns tend to echo across all levels, and what's inside you tends to manifest outside of you. Now, we could think about this in a very energy and new agey way, I suppose, if that's an interpretation that you're open to and you find helpful. We could think about it as the energy that you put out into the universe will echo back at you in some particular way. But for me, I think about it in much more of a pragmatic level, where if I've jumped to a conclusion about something or an assumption when I'm talking to someone, I have to admit that that's probably going to be displayed somehow subconsciously in my face, or I'll twitch the corner of my mouth or my facial expression, or I'll pause for that slight moment longer before I start speaking after they finish. And my observation is that people often pick up on that. Whereas when I can genuinely be trying to listen to them, try to see their sides of a perspective, try to solve a problem without winning, it's almost like my intention somehow flows through the very fabric of the words and my tone of voice and body language and all of this kind of thing. So for me, there's this set your intention and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's like, to me, I find it's a little bit cringy myself, even thinking about some of the new agey interpretations of it. But if we simply think about it as I'm at any one moment communicating far more information than I intend to and that I'm aware of, the other person's picking up on far more information that I intend them to and that I'm aware of. So if my goal is to influence them in a particular way, like I need to genuinely, it's almost like be genuine, isn't it? Like be honest. Don't be fake. Don't put on the front. Don't put on the mask. I suppose this in some ways means that the more honest that we can be, probably the more healthy that correlation would be, between the above and the below and the within and the without. Whereas when we're not honest and we've got these conflicting ideals and, we haven't thought things through before we act or say something, a lot of the time it does create tension outside in our, arguments and conflict that we have with other people. But then that also results in tension internally. and we don't sleep and we feel stressed and all that kind of thing. I'm sorry, it's just starting to rain here. I don't know if that's coming across in the microphone or not. I would love to know, by the way, do you mind if there's a little bit of background noise? Where I live, I have birds outside my window, and there's a soccer field where kids are often playing. And I usually shut my window, but I have to say there's a little part of me that feels a bit sad doing that. And I wonder if you would prefer me to share some of the background noise from the bit of Australia where I live. Let me know your thoughts. The best way to get in touch is podcast@simongood.com. So the third of the Hermetic principles is the principle of vibration. The idea here is that everything is in motion. I mean, this again is true even at the most fundamental level that we want to consider it, like even within an atom and the electrons, etc. Nothing is actually true. Everything is vibrating and bumping up against each other, etc. And in relationships, that is certainly a principle that is true. We tend to think about relationships as good or bad or healthy or not healthy or toxic or whatever. But the truth is that it's not the same. It changes over time. If it's toxic, it's not as toxic as it was yesterday, or maybe it's a little bit more toxic, or when this person's there, the toxicity levels is through the roof. And when they're not there, what do you know? Not so toxic. Everything vibrates, everything evolves, including our relationships. And so if they shift from moment to moment, what we need to do is to make sure that we're not bringing yesterday's vibe into today's relationship. A partner's warmth or coolness after a stressful day, it's not going to last forever. So I think this sometimes helps us not to take it as personally once we realize that actually these relationships themselves are in constant change. Today isn't tomorrow. The relationship state depends on what's going on and what this person's been doing and what other things have been stressing them out and draining them and all of this kind of thing. So the reaction that you cop from them isn't necessarily just going to be about what you've said and done. It's about the cumulative buildup of stress for them. And then it also helps us to maybe tune in a little bit to our own vibration. Like instead of thinking that I'm good at dealing with conflict or I'm bad at dealing with conflict or I'm the kind of person that does this or doesn't do this, maybe we could take more of a nuanced view and to say, today I'm feeling a little bit more worked up. I haven't had as much sleep as I normally would. I probably need something to eat before I go into that difficult conversation. Whereas on another day, I could just walk in and do it off the top of my head. The fourth Hermetic principle is the principle of polarity. The idea here is that everything is dual. There's no such thing as good or bad or, what would you say, like helpful or not helpful. Like a lot of these different values or valences, I suppose is the better word, that we put on these aspects of our life are just not true. Setbacks and problems and issues and challenges that we need to overcome, we have no long-term perspective about the impact that they have. In a lot of these cases, they're actually what we need and they make us stronger, even though in the moment they're incredibly unpleasant. But of course, if we had to choose, we would say that it's bad. Whereas if we zoom out and we think about this Hermetic principle, actually what we realize is that there's good and bad or helpful or not helpful or easy or difficult or things that were natural for me and things that were less natural in all of these different interactions that I'm having. And instead of thinking about conversations as that went really poorly or that went really well, stepping back and disconnecting a little bit from the outcomes of the conversations that you're in. And the irony there is that that often helps us to reduce the stress levels and therefore perform better, and we actually get to a better outcome as a result because we're able to let go of the importance of getting to that good outcome, if that makes sense. And every quality in relationships has its pair. Joy and sorrow, we need to sometimes display strength, sometimes to display vulnerability. If we want healthy, relationships, they often need to be balanced. So we crave intimacy, but we fear losing independence. Both of these things are true. And this is another example of the polarity in these relationships. And if you're a business owner or a manager and you're coaching your staff, this is a really important element to consider. Instead of having a very black and white, this is the path that they should tread approach to things, instead, perhaps it could be about there's going to be bits and pieces of this that are on both sides of the spectrum. And it's probably not that helpful for me to jump to conclusions about whether or not this is good or bad, so to speak, at all. It also can help us to develop options. If we've been very assertive with a particular person or in a particular situation, perhaps we could try being a little bit more empathetic or slowing down or taking a different approach. Whereas if we've been trying to be as supportive and listening and giving them a lot of airtime, maybe now the time is to be a little bit more firm, hold on to boundaries, and clarify expectations moving forward. So this brings us to the fifth principle, which is the principle of rhythm. Everything has its ebb and flow. If we think about nothing being purely static and everything kind of oscillating between these two poles, these two different perspectives or polar opposites, the rhythm is the patterns that happens in, the cycles of life, the highs and lows of relationships. And again, this is something that a lot of people don't think about, but there's always going to be ups and downs in our relationships. And a lot of the time there's particular patterns. If we could pause and just be a little bit curious about it, we realize that after I've just gotten back from a work trip, we often have a big fight. Or when we haven't seen each other for a long time, this is a particularly useful activity for reconnecting quickly. Relationships are going to have their ups and downs, which helps us to sometimes not panic at the extremes as well. If there's a week of tension with a friend, don't erase years of trusts. Ride the wave. Resist overreacting to a low point or a particular problematic period. Cycles repeat, so learning from them is another principle that we can apply, and it supercharges our ability to deal with conflict and project forward helpful relationships that work for us. So we should notice clashes, we should notice times when things are easier than it normally is. And what's different there? What are the patterns that might be involved? And this all helps us to master the flow. Once we can anticipate the swings back and forth, we can steadily progress through them. There's a really lovely way of thinking about this. Instead of saying this is a new low in our relationship, maybe you could ask yourself something like, I wonder if the tide is going out at the moment. Cause and effect is the sixth Hermetic principle, and the idea here is that every action has its reaction. Nothing happens in a vacuum, behaviors and outcomes are limited. So this means that people's actions and their behavior come from something. Like the universe itself is a product of cause and effect, and we can very much see that to some extent you get rewarded for the behaviors that you do, your intentions that you put out there. And I tend to find this quite helpful for empathizing with why someone might be doing a behavior that I wouldn't, or they're responding in a way that I don't think is correct. People act the way that they are because of the things that have happened to them. And that means that their behavior comes from something. It's their pain or their habits or their fears, and that comes from something. That comes from their upbringing or the way that their parents responded when they're upset or they were doing the wrong thing and they got punished in this particular way or ignored or rewarded in this particular way. And the same thing happens all through school. It's really just positive and negative reinforcement. Like behavior that gets rewarded is likely to be repeated. And so we see that again and again in people's behaviors. The thing is with conflict is that sometimes they've reached the end of the line where this behavior is not working for them, but it's almost like they've never had any healthy role models or never considered any options for doing something differently, which means that they're kind of in this Groundhog Day of recreating their own problems so that tomorrow effectively does become today, simply because they're assuming that everything else is everybody else's fault. Whereas if we understand that, the qualities that I want in a relationship with someone are literally going to depend on the actions that I take, all of a sudden it creates this sense of ownership. And it's like we really do need to collaborate, and we can think about the relationship with the other person then as a creative act. Like, how can I cultivate it a bit like a garden? How much time should I spend on it? What kind of fertilizer is good for it? What kind of activities should we do together? Which other people should we spend time with? All of this kind of thing. We can also apply this cause and effect principle at a fine-grained level of detail. This is one of the cheeky tricks that I used to use when I was a family counsellor. I don't know if most family counsellors would say that they use tricks on their clients, but I certainly did. I was working with court-ordered clients, and these were the absolute most pointy end of the spectrum that you can imagine in terms of conflict. They had been at family court, or the Federal Magistrates Court was the other one at the time. And for years, like 3 or 4 years kind of thing, both mum and dad had usually spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their legal teams. The kids were this traumatized, mess when we would meet them, and then we would meet the parents and give them some feedback about, look, your kids are really struggling here. And I was I don't know what you would say, like disappointed is the understatement of the century at how not open parents were to that. And, you know, in hindsight, probably the way that I was giving that feedback and certainly the way the other staff was giving the feedback might have contributed to them not being particularly open. But it didn't occur to me then. I used to think these clients have a problem. These clients aren't listening. You know, what's wrong with them? Because we always think about ourselves as the rational one, don't we? We assume that we are reasonable and others are the ones that have got it wrong. But the truth is that they can see your flaws too. So if you're dealing with brick walls that refuse to listen and you're banging your head against them, clients who won't take on board your helpful input about what their kids are needing, staff who don't want to follow the instructions that you're giving them, there's probably a reason why. And yes, there's parts of it that's their upbringing and their early childhood and their school and all this, but there's probably parts of what you're doing that's contributing to it as well. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the reality. They're probably mad at you because your tone might have stung, or they're worried about you bringing it up in front of other people, or they remember the last time that they had a conversation with you and they're still feeling a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. There's probably something that's happening to them. Okay, people act the way that they do because of the things that have happened to them, including what you've done and what you've said. So I used to meet these clients and I would say sometimes, like, I'm just a little bit confused listening to you because I know what you mean. You think this is what's best for the kids and all you've done is tried to communicate that clearly. And here the other parent is completely overreacting. Yep, I can understand what you're saying. That makes sense. The thing that doesn't make sense, and the reason why I'm a little bit confused, is if you're, you know, the pinnacle of logic, everything you're saying is rational, you've shared sufficiently all of the information, there's nothing that you've done which could be interpreted as being disrespectful, they are completely wrong to feel that way, then why are they upset? It's weird. What could you do differently if your goal was to get a different outcome from your ex-partner? And they didn't like me saying that, but I have to say that, you know, there's only so much placating and empathy and all of this kind of stuff you can do when you've just met somebody's kids and, you know, they're talking about, well, who knows what. I won't go into the details, but the kind of thing that would leave you extremely worried about them. Let's just leave it at that. So the final principle, and probably one that's quite well connected to that last point, is the principle of gender. And I'm not talking about males, men and women, I should say, but rather this idea that everything has masculine and feminine aspects. Now, again, the new agey kind of version of this might be the gentle and strong and this kind of thing. But even if we think about the male and female delineation within nature, it is connected to the reproductive patterns. So one has the pattern of sending out lots of seeds and effectively creating more options and more opportunities, the male of the species. And then you've got the female, which usually has a more limited number of reproductive elements, like one egg or a smaller number of eggs. And so they're more selective. They sort of play the role of refining and organizing and optimizing the different options. Now, I don't think this is, again, necessarily connected to men and women. It's more about finding the balance, the yin and the yang, in our relationships, in ourselves, in our behavior, and kind of in the interpretation that we're bringing to all of those things too. So every situation is probably going to call for a blend of gentle and firm. You'll need to be creative and speaking and putting ideas out there, and you'll need to listen and be open and be willing to hear somebody else's point of view. A good example where we see this a lot of the time is in leadership. You know, we want bold, and yet we want a leader who can listen. Both are vital. And so it's possible that you might be overusing one energy, so to speak, and neglecting the other. And conflict in particular, when relationships are not working well, we need both. We need wisdom as well as compassion. We need a time in some relationships to generate more options, like take a collaborative approach, and we might meet with the client or meet with a staff member or colleague and brainstorm. Let's think through options for fixing a rift, and we're going to pick the best one and really spend time on it. But there'll be a time for acting. This is the point where we need to refine and decide, well, which of those different options are we going to do, and what would the plan look like in terms of next steps? It's when we can balance those different, I don't know what you would call them, like aspects of our behavior or our energy, so to speak, if that's a metaphor that works for you. because a lot of the time this helps us to generate an additional layer of awareness, both in terms of the way that we're conveying ourselves, the communication that we're putting out there, the energy that we're sending out to the universe, so to speak, but also the interpretation that we're making. Maybe our perception has shifted somewhat, and instead of giving this person the benefit of the doubt, we're jumping the gun, and because we're going into self-protective mode, and that might be helpful, or maybe it's not. But if we can pause and become aware of it, all of a sudden it gives us the option to respond rather than just reacting. So what do you think? Those are those different 7 principles: gender, cause and effect, rhythm, polarity, vibration, correspondence, and mentalism. Do you tend to think about the universe in this way? Do you prescribe to this idea that what is within will be echoed somehow without, that what is above somehow is below? Or does this all sound like completely new age mumbo jumbo and you wish that I would go back to the pseudo-scientific episodes that I normally do, which at least, even though they are pseudo-scientific, at least there's the word scientific in there. So Simon, for goodness sakes, could you please pull your head in and go back to the normal format of the podcast? I'd love to hear from you. As I said, the best way to get in touch is podcast@simongood.com, and my surname has an E on the end, so it's SIMONGOODE.com. If you would like information about my training workshops, hiring me as a workplace mediator, or hiring me as a coach to maybe come in and facilitate a session with your team, then please feel free to get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and all the best managing the conflict situations that you're dealing with over the next week or two. Bye for now.